Hear me? Yeah, good.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I have a disease which is called logorrhea, which is the impossibility to stop yourself talking. And since the time is short, I decided that it would be best if I restricted myself by doing an audio PowerPoint, so you won't have to look at me, okay? I thought originally this session would be in the morning. I didn't read the timetable, so it starts off with good morning. So I'm going to run this audio PowerPoint through, okay?
I think we cannot hear anything, so I'm not sure if the silence is meant to be there.
You cannot hear anything.
No.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Oh no. Oh, this is good, isn't it? How do I share? That is not good. I better sort this out. Sorry. Oh dear.
Okay, perhaps if you silence your...
I'll sort it out. We start with somebody else, okay?
Maybe a solution would be if you turn off your microphone, then the sound from your computer will appear. I don't know.
Yes. Resume share and now where?
It's on the left, in the left corner, left low corner.
Slideshow.
Okay. I'm sorry, but I can't hear it.
Maybe you should start screen sharing once again, but click on the option share with the sound, share with computer sound.
Right. Can you hear me now?
You
can hear me now.
But
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, what I'll do then is I'll just take you through the. You won't be able to see the slides. Oh, this is a disaster. Okay. Well, look, I'll make my intervention really brief. Okay. Without
you can show us your screen if you like. This is fine.
Yeah. Well, I've lost. Meanwhile, I've lost the. Come on. Oh no. Look. No. This isn't working. Okay. Look, I will just talk to you. Okay. Right. What I wanted to say, without all the pictures, etc., is simply this. I think that the trouble with using the word fascism, and therefore to be anti-fascist, is that the word fascism really covers many different things according to the people who use it. There are two basic schools of thought now. The Marxist school of thought, which is very complicated and has many versions, has developed its own theory of fascism, which has left a deep impact on the former Soviet empire because it was taught as an orthodoxy. And for many people still, either former Eastern European Soviet Marxists, or for many Western Marxists, fascism is still associated with capitalism, and it's seen as a basic tendency of all capitalist societies. In other words, there is a sort of slide from liberal capitalism to fascism. And I'll give you a concrete example now. Trump was very clearly not a liberal. He was not a constitutional liberal. His values were anti-liberal, misogynist, racist, and there are a whole load of neuroses in there. And he also, in practice, ignored the letter and the spirit of constitutional politics in the US. He fixed appointments, he tried to fix juries, he did terrible things to American politics, yeah? Now, his racism and his anti-Mexican comments and his misogyny, for somebody who comes from a Marxist theory of fascism, is very easy to associate with the inherent tendency of Western democracy to move towards fascism. Because if fascism is a child of capitalism, if it is capitalism without liberalism, capitalism without restraints of human rights and universal principles, then all societies tend towards capitalism when liberalism is not working hard to constrain them. So that somebody like Bolsonaro is associated widely, if you read a lot of Marxist commentary, with another example of a sort of modern state with fascist tendencies. And even in the American press, you have two very interesting constituencies who see Trump in terms of fascism. There's a major movement called Refuse Fascism, which is a militant anti-fascist, anti-Trump movement. It's very small in number, but it's quite vociferous. It interrupted the Oscar ceremony earlier in the year. Then there are some liberal commentators on Trump who also use the word fascism. And there are many bloggers and many newspaper writers who are not Marxists, but they still see Trump in terms of fascism. They talk about the rise of fascism and the tendency of fascism to take over in America. And one example of that is there's somebody called Madeleine Albright, who used to be Secretary of State, and she wrote an entire book called Fascism, A Warning, portraying America as sort of sliding towards fascism. There's also quite a well-known academic called Jason Stanley, who has written a lot on this. There's also quite a famous academic called Finkelstein, who's written about populism, or Finkelstein with an CH, who's written about fascism and populism. And they all would see Trump and Trumpism as inherently tending towards fascism. There's another constituency that tends to see fascism in him, which is the alt-right. It's well known that in Charlottesville and in other contexts where the far right, and notably the Proud Boys, were supporting Trump, they saw Trump as one of their own, that as somehow giving a green light to alt-right and extreme right politics. So I'm not saying that it is not a complicated issue. And if you are persuaded that Trumpism is a form of fascism, and that people like Putin or Orban or the Rassemblement National, or even UKIP, I've seen being called fascist, Farage, if all these different populist movements are fascist, then really there really is fascism everywhere. And one of my slides was showing how a liberal commentator in America calls the Truth and Justice Party in Poland fascist. So if you see modern politics in terms of a sort of tension between liberal democracy and fascism, you get one sort of analysis of modern politics, and you protest about certain things in a certain way. My message, for example, today is really that there is quite a body of academic opinion that makes quite an important distinction between fascism as a quite restricted type of extremist politics and other forms of illiberal behavior. And I mean, there are some people who see Islamism and jihadism as fascist. Some people see the extreme right of the American church as fascist. There are people who see fascism lurking in all sorts of forms of behavior. But there is an academic position which I represent, and I have helped spread, as you heard from my mini biography. I am representative of a body of opinion in academia, which is actually very widespread and publishes a lot, which says no, fascism is a particular form of extremism. It is a revolutionary form of ultranationalism and racism. And if it doesn't want to create a new order, if it doesn't want to destroy the constitutional system, not just bend the constitutional system like Trump obviously has been doing, but destroy it and replace it with a new order, it isn't fascist. Now, why is this distinction important? Well, if you look, for example, at the AfD in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, now it's quite clear that many people assumed that the rise of the AfD in Germany was a symptom of the rise of fascism. And lots of people write about that. The German state has a particular office called the Verfassungsschutzammt, which the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. And they have to decide whether movements are legal or illegal. Now, for the record, the AfD is seen by the Verfassungsschutz not as fascist, but as radical, radikal. If you're radical, you're legal. If you're extreme, you're illegal. Now, this is quite important because there was a wing of the AfD led by a man called Höcke. Now, he was demonstrably fascist in the rhetoric about a new Germany. He was not just nostalgic for the Nazi regime and had many neo-Nazis in his following, but he used language which really did imply that the modern liberal Germany had to go to allow the German folk to arise again. And as a result of a particular book by somebody influenced by the attitude to fascism that I represent, Höcke was actually disbanded. His wing, the Höcke-Flügel, was disbanded because it was illegal. Now, the German state has not tried to make the AfD illegal because from an academic point of view, it may be radical, it may be very unpleasant, it may be racist, but it's not fascist, okay? So what I was going to argue with all my lovely pictures and things which you couldn't see was that if you think you're anti-fascist and if you want to do things about fascism, it's very important that you work out what you think you are anti, what you think you are against. And the reason for this is I think there are different tactics for fighting different things. I'll give you an example. Racism, clear racism, and the incitement to hatred in England is illegal. And you fight political hatred, which incites hatred and violence, legally. I mean, you might like to have a protest about it, but there are other ways of protesting. Racism, misogyny, prejudice against people of a different ethnicity. I think the main way that can be fought in a proper democracy is through legislation. In England, we are very backward, but gradually a movement like the Black Lives Matter and the impact of Black Lives Matter on Britain is actually really shifting attitudes to BAME, that's Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people in society. That I'm living through quite a shift in that. Now, eventually, there should be more minorities in power, more minorities on TV, everything else. Now, that's fighting racism is fighting prejudice, but it's not fighting fascism. So my basic point is this, that I think before we put all the different behaviors which we hate in a single pot, in a single box, and say, we hate fascism, we must fight fascism, we should be very discriminating about what we are hating, and we should ask ourselves, are there legal channels, are there more effective ways of fighting this? By, for example, in the case of Höcke, a particular book by an academic called Kemperer exposed Höcke as a fascist. In Slovakia recently, a fascist politician was exposed by a legal case and is now barred from politics. And the person who was brought into the trial to testify against this man was somebody who was not a Marxist theorist of fascism, he was an academic theorist of fascism, and he was able to prove that the agenda of this man was anti-democratic. So I do believe that people have to be alarmed about illiberalism. For example, when Orban got rid of the CEU in the Central European University in Hungary, for me, that's outrageous. And I've done a lot of work for the CEU. But I think it's very misleading to call it fascist. The idol or the ideal of Orban is Putin, and I don't believe Putin is a fascist. I think a lot of the battle against what we call fascism is really a battle against illiberalism, against corruption, and against vested interests, and against bodies in society who want to put a stop to democratization and liberal freedoms. They are evil, they are nasty, you want to stop them, but you are not going to challenge them by stopping fascism. So that is my basic position, and I will be interested to hear what else people say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Professor Griffin. Do we have our moderator on board with us?
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. The presentation was great, although the original plan didn't work out. And now we are ready to hear the presentation by Dr. Ewa Majewska. She's a feminist philosopher and activist. She lectured on gender studies at the University of Warsaw and got a scholarship on the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. She conducted research at the University of California in Berkeley. She's also the author of the books A Streetcar Named Recognition, Feminism and Solidarity After after Neoliberalism, Art as a Guise, Censorship and Other Forms of Politication of Culture, Feminism as Social Philosophy, Essays in the Sociology of Family. She was also a co-editor of the book The Captive Mind too, Neoliberalism and Its Critics, and published her articles in journals such as eFlux, Science, Philosophical Review, Ethics, Modern Culture, Theoretical Praxis, or Przekrój. And today, she's going to have a presentation, Weak Resistance or the Antifascism of a Tired Housewife. Please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I would like also to announce that next year, my next book, The Feminist Antifascism, Counterpublics of the Common, will be published by Verso, so you can all read it. It's going to be in English. And now the presentation is entitled Weak Resistance or the Antifascism of a Tired Housewife. And I will basically read it. I'll try to go slowly so that we can all follow. The subject of political agency in Europe has always been masculine, straight, heroic, and usually white. Or has he? Many theoretical interventions have been conducted in the fields of social sciences and humanities in order to transform the perception of political agency. And some of these transformative interventions need to be installed at the core of the research on fascism and anti-fascism. Otherwise, we will be stuck in 19th century imaginary fields forever. The Angry Housewife, and we can think of variations on Antigone and Ismene, as suggested by Bonnie Honig, but also of Danuta Danielsson, the Polish Jewish refugee in Sweden, or Tess Asplund, also doing anti-fascism in Sweden, are figures not unseen in the large anti-fascist tradition, but seldom visible for anti-fascist research. We can change that, and this presentation is a step towards such direction. The theoretical image of the political subject of Europe has always been male. It always came from the privileged classes and most often had a pale body. Look at Aristotle's version of the public debate. It is only accessible to the men whose basic needs are satisfied, and thus they need no engagement in labor. They have servants and wives. Their ancestors have lived in Athens for at least 3 generations, and they are free men, not slaves, who, by the way, for Aristotle, are not even human beings, they are basically tools. This image of subjects predisposed for politics has organized the political theory and imagination since 2,500 years. No wonder that we have difficulties with it also in the field of anti-fascism. A very important part of the construction of the modern political subject was tacitly devoted to build its countless others, destined to live in levels of precarity, which the white European man only discovered in this century, as Isabelle Lorey kindly reminded us recently. This tacit construction of the other, supposed other, of the European subject, has its colonial and gendered specificity, resulting in the impossibility of properly representing those foreclosed and marginalized selves. Thus, the mechanisms of speaking about women's anti-fascism or non-Western resistance, just to mention those two, drown in the futile effort to reappropriate the discourse of politics created for the political subject of Europe and not for his others. This is the lesson of postcolonial studies in the version practiced by Beatrice Spivak and the Subaltern Studies Group and countless other scholars. And it has recently been questioned by such intellectuals as Vivek Chiber and Bruno Latour in very different ways, but those authors share one thing in common: a preoccupation with the necessity to overcome the uncertainty and discomfort typical for the hermeneutics of suspicion. Those philosophical debates should, but not always do, enter methodological discussions of all disciplines within humanities, arts, and social sciences. However, they did not, for example, sufficiently inform the historical and anthropological fields, at least in Poland, which now allows to speak of all Polish people as descendants of aristocracy, which is obviously fake, or define the historical forms of public sphere as solely elitist phenomena. The search for universality and the return to the Enlightenments and the hopes and demands located in rationality cannot neglect their own limitations. One of those limitations, I would say an epistemological one, is the impossibility of imagining women as political subjects. Although there are multiple other groups remaining in the political limbo of European political thought, I would like to focus on women and discuss our political agency in ways challenging the blind spots and exclusions of contemporary anti-fascist discourse, still to a large extent deprived of a decent epistemological feminist shift. So as you see up till now, I think you can recognize my position using the referencing the vocabulary of Professor Griffin as a feminist Marxist academic. That would be the methodological sort of background. There is perhaps an interesting issue concerning women's presence in the anti-fascist theory that needs discussion, although it concerns theories perceived as feminist or pro-feminist, such as those of Wilhelm Reich or the Frankfurt School, and in particular, I mean here Theodor Adorno and his work on the authoritarian family, the collection of research articles, I would say, or Klaus Teweleit. So these authors, all of them are supportive towards women. They are actually criticizing misogyny, and they are pointing to the fact that misogyny constitutes a natural element of fascism. And they are all academics. perhaps with the exception of Reich. In these theories, which criticize the fascist intersection of misogyny and racism, particularly in its anti-Semitic version, the role and agency of women is solely seen as passive. They are depicted, or we are depicted, I should say, as divided by the fascist ideology into two groups. Either the idealized group of holy virgins and mothers, so therefore caregivers and distant muses of virtue and chastity. You can find beautiful descriptions of this kind of idealized innocent femininity in letters of fascists or journals of fascist military members collected by Klaus Teweleit in his Masculine Fantasies, amazing work. Or the other group, much less holy and heavily sexualized vamps, I would call them, often connoted with bodily insubordination and racial impurity. These two main positions available for the feminine genre makes it practically unimaginable to think of women's or feminist anti-fascism. This would be one unexpected, I would say, obstacle to our efforts to discuss feminist anti-fascism, still perturbingly central in contemporary political and theoretical analysis of women opposing fascism. There are two general reasons why this image of women in anti-fascist logic and theory is problematic. First is that it stabilizes women, all of us, the holy and the unholy as well, in the position of victims of the fascist imagination and practice. From there, it seems impossible to imagine the very same women, already petrified by such imaginary politics, to even take a step towards active resistance or fight. Such petrification of women in the stabilized and passive position of victimhood can be compared to the problematic figure of the Muslim in George Agamben's otherwise brilliant discussion of the Homo sacer and the state of exception. His theory has been criticized by the combined forces of two monumental authors of the feminist post-structuralism, Gayatri Spivak and Judith Butler, who in their book, the book they wrote together, Who Sinks the Nation State, demand the liberation of the supposedly passive and non-resistant subject of oppression from the perpetuation of their political inactivity, supposedly, by the discourse of emancipation and critique. So therefore, this figure of Muslim and more generally the figure of Homo sacer is criticized by Spivak and Butler for supposedly not containing any political agency of whatever kind. Here we encounter another major problem of the stabilizing image of women as passive victims of fascism, the one which could be formulated as a pertinent reiteration of the rejection of the passive and victimized subjects as those who supposedly do not resist, whose passivity excludes action, resistance, and other forms of political agency. Here I would like to remind of a very famous figure of feminine passivity, namely Ismene from Sophocles' tragedy of Antigone. This quiet and kind younger sister of Antigone makes the whole story possible, according to Bonnie Honig. In her feminist reading, Honig suggests that sisters are bound together by a sororal anti-patriarchal pact, which allows them to shift roles, to express care and solidarity, and makes it possible to contradict the law of state represented by Creon. I would not like to idealize any of these positions. I would just like to argue that perhaps instead of perpetuating the normative theoretical perspective in which the political is solely expressed by either war or rational argumentation, we should look at other expressions of resistance, such as the everyday gestures of those practicing dissent in more tacit and less heroically visible ways. While we still tend to think that reproductive labor is par excellence inscribed in the supposedly unreflexive domain of the everyday, so therefore also conforming to the cycle of life, we might want to think of the partners of political activists, for instance, who stay home and from there maintain the complex relations with their arrested or deported activists' husbands or wives. How would that reshape our notion of political subject? Is a woman politically engaged while carrying letters, for instance, in and out of prison, surviving threats and seductive suggestions of stepping out of her involvement with a dissident husband, or vice versa? So this can also be gender-wise reversed. Are there non-heroic everyday strategies of anti-fascism which have been with us since forever, yet which have not become the central objects of political anti-fascist analysis, are we perhaps excluding the largest part of anti-fascist political agency, which does not consist in bombing or otherwise directly fighting fascism on the streets or in publications, but which consists in a variety of practice of caring for life and equality, solidarity by means of care, education, socialization, support, building solidarity networks, and other forms of non-heroic agency. The ways anti-fascism is presented usually maintain the heroic vision of political agency, giving men much more space than women in its visual representations. There are two images, however, which I would like to discuss with you, both sharing the exceptionality of, and I'm now going to enumerate this exceptionality. So they present women approaching a fascist, so it's a woman who contradicts fascism. Second characteristic of these images is that they show those women in agency which is not typical for a male agency, being either force or this kind of very rational activities. Then they show women who are not sexualized, who are not made prettier, or it's not a ballerina or a model or something. It's basically ordinary women. And I know the category is controversial, but nevertheless I will use it. And perhaps I'm going to show you the pictures I'm talking about so that you also see them. Okay, let me. So this is going to be a bit complicated because I didn't make a presentation. So you're just going to see my screen. And the image is not very big, but how? So I hope you see the image already. Can you please?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, so this is one image. Maybe I'll show you two of them then, as they can fit, or three. So okay, there we go. I know we don't see much. Okay, so we see the three images. So the black and white image in one corner is Danuta Danielsson, the Polish Jewish refugee to Sweden, who in 1985 attacked a neo-Nazi with her handbag. I hope you can see the handbag. The picture was taken by Hans Runeson. Then below we see a picture whose author I forgot to copy, so I don't remember who made the picture. It's an image of a monument which was built, I think, 2 years ago, of the Danuta Danielsson. And then the third image shows it was made by Daniel Lagerlof in 2016, and it shows Tess Asplund marching sort of against neo-Nazi demonstration. So these are very ordinary, again, I use a word which I'm going to explain, ordinary women, and we might be tempted to say, and yet most of us would not use this word as it is heavily burdened with controversies. These controversies of the word ordinary are often there for good reason. The mechanisms of projection, appropriation, misunderstanding, or other forms of scholarly sort of détournement and mystification happen all too often. So therefore, we avoid the word ordinary. However, without it, we are perhaps also insufficiently equipped to investigate the political agency in anti-fascism. So what I'm trying to say is that if we don't use the word ordinary, we might be lost when approaching forms of agency against fascism, which do not conform to the heroic, brave, or extremely rational modes of acting, and yet they are performing anti-fascist political agency. This is the main reason why I argued the feminist and post-colonial epistemological tools of hermeneutics of suspicion should remain with us, although they should be handled with care. In case of reorganizing the women depicted on the images presented here, recognizing the women depicted here, we need a category somehow similar to ordinary, perhaps everyday or not non-heroic are in place here. I could also argue that weak is a good word. The acts of resistance depicted on these images follow the script of a very important East European narrative, the one expressed in Power of the Powerless, the essay of Václav Havel, which was published in 1978 and smuggled into Poland, and inspired some of the Solidarność makers in 1980. The everyday non-heroic ordinary acts of resistance are always born in a moment of fear. of being overwhelmed with empires and violence surrounding the subject, feeling isolated and small. One of my favorite narratives depicting such state is to be found in the Les Guattaris, Mille Plateaux, where in the chapter concerning La Ritournelle, so the refrain, we read, now I quote the Les Guattari, a child in the dark, gripped with fear, comforts himself by singing under his breath. He walks and holds to his song. Lost, he takes shelter or orients himself with his little song as best he can. This song is like a rough sketch of a calming and stabilizing, calm and stable center in the heart of chaos. Perhaps the child skips as he sings, hastens or slows his pace, but the song itself is already a skip. It jumps from chaos to the beginning of an order in chaos and is in danger of breaking apart at any moment. There is always sonority in Ariadne's thread or the Song of Orpheus, end of quote. This is how arts and radical politics begin, according to Deleuze Guattari again. This is also where we find non-heroic politics. Maria Janion, one of the most important Polish intellectuals, has warned against the wrongs of heroic messianism, as she calls the conservative historical politics of the current government. Instead, we should perhaps look at the weak messianism of Walter Benjamin, at the vulnerable and precarious pacts between generations. Living in Warsaw, one cannot think of better ways realizing this never again sort of principle. In these images that we see on the screen, of infuriated and quiet women, we encounter the power of the powerless. We see people who know they might not stand a chance against the fascist waves. Nevertheless, they try to make a gesture, resist the power, transform reality in the only ways they have. There are many more of such gestures. However, they only seldom get photographed, mainly because photographers are taught to document the heroic or rational men rather than women in political photographs. We are used to images of various Mariannas, on the other hand, or heavily aesthetized and or sexualized images of women's misery and sorrow, but we usually do not encounter image of women simply doing anti-fascism on the everyday basis, by their everyday activities of care and education, or by their militant actions in normal conditions of war, activism, or intellectual and cultural labor. And we should definitely see more of that. The notion of counterpublics is the last one I would like to bring into this discussion. Counterpublics are always many, as Nancy Fraser rightly insists, and they are heterogeneous. They could even be called transversal, which is the word expanded or promoted by Frédéric Guattari, as they cut through the social strata, forms of organization, normative, symbolic, and political orders to cover all the fields where those involved find themselves. Discussing the US-American feminist movement as an example of feminist counterpublics, Fraser contradicts the main principles of how the classical liberal or conservative version of the public sphere has been presented historically, from Aristotle to Jürgen Habermas. The counterpublics are many, they transversally cut through social strata, they are hybridic and heterogeneous, often made by people involved in paid or reproductive labor, affect and care. So therefore they contradict all the principles that Aristotle has set in his Politics 2,500 years ago. And feminist counterpublics are sometimes conflicted and may contain contradictions. They also practice the everyday politics much more often than traditional recognized versions of political agency. They thus act transformatively, cutting through media, schools, academia, culture and business, as well as institutional and grassroots politics, demanding that the private and public are not separated anymore. As a genuine politics of embodied subjects, the feminist counterpublics aim at the recognition of their politics as mainstream and radical at the same time. Now, in the reception of the recent women's demonstration, as well as many of the Black Lives Matter protests, the media and most politicians tend to treat those massive expressions of political involvement as somehow marginal, by presenting them as only representative for those particular currents of politics, be it women's rights or the rights of Black population. So in the popular coverage of, for instance, the International Women's Strike or women's strikes in Poland or women's strike in the United States of America, those feminist demonstrations are conveniently separated from so there is anti-Trump opposition and there are some women marches. And the connection between the two sometimes is somehow built, but very often it's just dropped. Also, similarly, I would say with the Black Lives Matter protests, seriously the fact that so many people stood up against racism obviously had an influence, and this influence has been analyzed in the discussions of the results of US-American elections. However, still there is a tendency of conveniently sort of separating the anti-racist and feminist movements from the anti-Trump and therefore also anti-fascist struggles. So this convenient separation of these two major strands of anti-fascist politics, from anti-Trumpism, anti-Cacism, anti-Bolsonarism, just to name a few, allows the liberal opposition to preserve its splendid isolation from the non-liberal, non-elitist currents of social politics, and politics generally, obviously. In the past, they would be associated with the left. However, the left has been so conveniently expelled from the spectrum of political thought and practice after 1989 that it still needs time to recover in the global politics. Thus, we not only do not see it mentioned or discussed anymore, but also the social formations of the subaltern, oppressed, and discriminated against remain as sort of free-floating signifiers, which reduces their political significance and condemns them to be separated one from another as well. This political and theoretical void needs to be discussed and changed, I think, but also the perpetuation of the marginalization by specialization of the current anti-fascist movements, be it feminist or anti-racist, needs to be sublated for a more transversal and thus also more transformative model of politics and theoretical debates. And here, to respond to some of the concerns mentioned in the previous presentation, I would like to suggest that even if we assume that in the, let's say, feminist protests, only a part of postulates, of demands are explicitly anti-fascist, we should do it step by step. We should not reject feminist movement as something else entirely than anti-fascism, but we should compare the more traditional anti-fascism with the feminist current movements, because it might appear, and in the case of the Polish as well as American feminist movement, it does appear that all the postulates that, or the demands that they produce are actually anti-fascist. So basically, this separation should be stopped. I believe that the notion of counterpublics can allow the framework for such necessary shift in anti-fascist politics, theory and practice. So I would argue that the social movements are transforming the public sphere, not necessarily by means of the classical liberal or conservative public sphere, which is not available for the majority of members of those movements, but by means of counterpublics, who at times become quite massive or quite popular, and therefore also quite effective in their political agency. Starting with the necessary recognition of anti-fascism as once again, and very unfortunately becoming the matter of the common, not just of minorities of the political spectrum, we need a perspective allowing a popular, public and accessible debate on the conditions, needs and aims of anti-fascist politics. Its elitist, segregationist patterns need thus to be dismantled, its mainly historical focus abandoned, I would say, and a contemporary self-reflexive mode installed, together with feminist and decolonial epistemological tools. This is probably the only way for anti-fascism to become a universal, inclusive perspective of the common. Anti-fascism is, in other more limited versions, have already proven their insufficient potential in confrontation with the challenges of today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It's incredibly important now at the times of women's strikes worldwide. If our audience, if other participants have any thoughts or questions, you can save it for the debate that is going to take place at the end of the panel. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Marc Herbst. Dr. Marc Herbst received his PhD from Goldsmith Center for Cultural Studies in 2019. He has co-edited the Journal of Aesthetics and Protests since he co-founded it in Los Angeles in 2001. He recently worked with the Berlin Prinzessinia Garden to co-edit Everything Gardens, Growing Up in the Ruins of Modernity, that strives to develop an eco-social method of learning through the coming 100 years of climate change. It is situated in a garden in the heart of cosmopolitical Berlin. He's working with Pluto Press and artists, activists John Jordan and Isa Fremel to edit a book on post-climate radical creative practice based on the lessons learned in the Zat autonomous zone in France. And today he's going to present the presentation, Culture Beside Itself.
Hello, I'm assuming that my audio is on and I'll begin speaking. So I'm going to be reading a paper. I don't often deliver papers, so bear with me as I stumble through my own words. Yeah, so this paper is about an arts-based research project interested in anti-fascist questions, an activist-based project, a 20-year-old one with no formal institutional ties besides the individuals and movements within which it is entangled, and the ambitions of its co-editors, one of them including me. With autonomy to formal institutionality, there is no project description conforming to measurable academic research goals. Rather, this project aimed to spur common social political praxis and radical research. Praxis, that is, embedded within social relations exceeding word circumcision. So while academic papers' introductions normally lay out key questions, this paper initially resists linguistic enclosure to give distinctions between discipline-specific research and open, common movement knowledge development, some breathing space. There is an empirical difference between meanings that share similar words, but distinctive ends. In contradistinction, let me make clear that this project and focus here is an independent journal, the 11th issue of the Journal of Aesthetics Protest project, a project that I will soon detail. This is a copy, the paper copy of the journal. I'm not going to I will be spending time with the material, but I don't have slides, but there is a front section, which is essays, and then a back section, which is composed, you'll find, of newsletters from a variety of autonomous collectives. So in the second instance, a bit more about the framing of this paper. This paper somehow thinks through the ways that collective discursive praxis relates to either the stabilization of formal institutional interests that might also activate progressive and anti-fascist action, and collective praxis that sounds like it has similar effects to the politically and culturally powerful, but because of their entanglements in the marginal, are different. In slightly different words, this paper will glance around differences between more particular and more universal articulations in relationship to anti-fascist praxis and cultural theory. From a workshop proposal written for an event at the British Film Archives related to the 11th issue of the journal, co-editor Claudia Firth and I write, with the rise of ubiquitous media and the expanded role the arts and cultural industries play in hosting public forums, contemporary ways of producing and consuming culture seems to provide people from marginalized communities every reason to engage with any sort of institution to mediate and circulate their work. In this context, activist conversations around what it is to sell out, debated by previous generations that define ethics and terms for institutional engagement, seem ever more antiquated. The seeming disappearance of gatekeeping notions of all kinds as tools for top-down management or as an expression of common sense politics from the disempowered contributes to the sense that anything goes. Yet we all somehow know that the sense that anything goes disproportionately benefits large corporations and faceless governance. This paper doesn't discuss gatekeeping. Rather, it discusses the collective research terms articulated in the journal 11 issue submission call, soon to be read. First, about the Journal of Aesthetics and Protest that I co-founded with my brother Robbie in Los Angeles at the height of the US globalization movement in 2000. Some of the books that we've published are at my shoulder. We and our co-editors, Cara Baldwin and Christina Olka, had gone through CalArts, avant-garde art school in Los Angeles, We'd all come out of the 1990s DIY culture of anarchist info shops, queer and riot girl scenes, and pirate radio. We helped launch RTS, reclaimed the street-style street party protests. RTS seemed a radical break from normal protest forms, reflecting its originality. My New York City RTS group received infrastructural support from the 1960s freak Yippie alumni and tactical aid from ACT UP members. But it was the radical break of Seattle's anti-WTO protests that directly drove the journal's founding. Robbie and I were working with the first indie media group. We conceptualized the journal as an adjunct to indie media, able to research greater theoretical details as a movement research organ for collective aesthetico-strategic innovation. These movements were extra-parliamentary and countercultural, finding space for in the not yet gentrified neighborhoods of New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, etc., with solidarity links in London and wherever the anti-globalization movement found movement. We had no fund. We currently have no funding. We've never had any funding or institutional structure or tax status. I posted a link to our website in the chat. We'd all read Bell Hooks then, and revisiting Hooks' words for the British Film Archive event, this quote from her essay, Choosing the Margin, resonates. Within complex and ever-shifting realms of power relations, do we position ourselves on the side of colonizing mentality, or do we continue to stand in political resistance with the oppressed, ready to offer our ways of seeing and theorizing, of making culture towards the revolutionary effort which seeks to create space where this unlimited access to pleasure and power of knowing, where transformation is possible? The choice is crucial. It shapes and determines our response to existing cultural practice and our capacity to envision new, alternative, oppositional aesthetic acts. It informs the way we speak about these issues, the language we choose. Language is also a place of struggle. Time and events have judged the journal's theoretical tastes. Our official motto is that we're a weirdo archive, a weirdo archive. Knowing that culture operates weirdly, we now understand ourselves as a marginal theoretical project, one through which waves of critical, artistic, and activist practice pass through before moving on to better financed and higher profile platforms. We remain in some background, or as Gregory Chollet first articulated on our pages, among culture's dark matter. So, in appreciation of our marginality and in light of political and cultural developments, I and co-editors Robbie Herbst, Claudia Firth, Amber Hickey, released our 11th issue's submission call in late 2018, which I will read, or excerpts from. Dear readers, we invite you and your collective to potentially, we invite you and your collective or potential collective to join us in a research interrogation of what it means to culturally produce beside or autonomous to cultural or political institutions, but not in ignorance to what they organizationally and institutionally produce. This in response to rising fascism and the resurgent right, which we politically and culturally organize somehow in relation to. This will be a collection of collectively edited projects. Newsletter submissions from individuals will not be considered. We will consider submissions from institutionally organized projects if our research interests align. In a time of rising fascism, how do autonomous, critical, creative, and activist practices tend to their common yet particular cosmopolitical situation outside of established forms and politics of parties and cultural institutions? Over the year, still reading from the call, which will go on for a bit, over the year, you will investigate questions related to autonomous and anti-fascist and or avant-garde practice, whatever is most appropriate to your community, context, or inquiries. Through activity in reading groups, in open discussion. However, as a contribution to our 11th issue, you will be invited to collaboratively produce your own 1, 2, or 4-page newsletter and to distribute it within your community as a part of your active practice. We will provide $10 grants in order to assist you in paying for your photocopies. We will provide you $10 grants in order to assist you in paying for your photocopies. One collective asked for that, no other collective did. For your local newsletter, you will be your own editorial collective. At the end of the year, a compendium of your local newsletters will comprise the bulk of the journal issue. going on with the call. We hope to spark locally situated investigations on what it means to purposely practice outside of, but in some indeterminate affinity to the somewhat progressive or radical institutions whose profiles have risen over the last few years. Groups like DSA, Podemos, and Plan C, in my context, are formal political groups that attempt to meaningfully respond to issues this journal has extra institutionally concerned itself for years. In this moment, when party politics can be justified by their existential fight against the right and its controlling slash killing of the planet, this issue supports the ongoing ways of being autonomous to, organized outside of, but in some relationship to hopeful formal politics. Particularly, but not exclusively, we are interested in questions that culturally think through left politics towards some beyond. For, as this project sits besides functionalized political institutions, it also sits critically besides the functionalization of culture. Therefore, we are interested in how culture that seems to be outside of institutions acts to build other ways of being, and not just through the representation of the political as good museums and galleries can do. In this way, this is a cultural question as much as it is a political one. With your help, this issue hopes to reclaim the gap between the radical imaginary built on actual social capacity and formal politics. Last few paragraphs from the submission call. I'm skipping bits and pieces of the analysis in the submission call. Famously, Adorno described the capture of autonomous cultural production through the rationalizing industries of Hollywood and beyond. This journal has never fully bought into the death of the avant-garde, recognizing eruptions of all that can be associated with 1968, such as Situationists, Yippies, and the Panthers, as also leaning towards other possible ways of being. This journal comes out of the 1990s, when the collapse of the Soviet Union left a vacancy in the American left imaginary. This vacancy was quickly filled by anarchist-inspired movements and ways of doing. Jump forward to the arts and media practices of today. Once radical practices now seem to grind on alongside the functionalized cultural realms. That is, again, they seem to be part of the functionalized cultural realms, shuttling towards or guarding against Anthropocenic death, or remaining somewhat marginalized. Within the current context of rising fascism and the surging right, experimental radical culture should clamor for space at the center stage, but also nurture its own grounds within common and marginal life. That is, autonomous work cares for what we could call the universal, but also for the always particular cosmopolitical margin. This issue looks at this space. So this issue was launched in the summer of 2020 and includes 19 newsletters from Europe, North America, Asia, Australia. We contacted collectives under regimes flirting with neo-fascism, such as Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, and the Philippines, but only eventually were able to receive submissions in this effort from America and Poland. The issue also contains essays, interviews from the Out of the Woods collective on eco-fascism, art historian Hamad Al-Douri on the art world's false promise of universality, Tools for Action art collective on non-fascist public performance, and print theorist Nick Thorburn on the form of the newsletter, which I'll go into in a little bit later on. To a great extent, collectives actively engaged with research projects, with the research project of coming to engage with what it is to meaningfully orient critical practice towards their context rather than some kind of organizing structure for thought and action that comes from something outside of them. So I'm going to now read some examples mixed in with other words of mine. E.g., a collective of internationally recognized theorists authored the Democratic Socialists of America Santa Cruz Eco-Social Working Group's Multi-Species Tribunal 4-page newsletter. Quoting from this newsletter, the tribunal is gathering testimonials that offer evidence of harm enacted against the common by private property. Participants represented a broad spectrum of human and more than human witnesses and their advocates, including interdisciplinary scholars, artists, and activists who work on social environmental justice issues in Central California. The longer-term goal of the tribunal is to develop a comprehensive understanding of what is uncommon among us, how we constitute that us, and how to promote values that recognize and privilege what is shared rather than what is privately owned and controlled. Many of the newsletters can be read as a coming down into collectivity from individual professional practice. Many thus discuss negotiations of desires and or conflicts expressed through the particular formations. For example, the unbridled expressions of desire from an anonymously authored newsletter distributed from Utrecht's Reading Room Project. The sensuousness of the sexual, the undergirding desire towards a future that can never be mastered, but improvised, sent, a future that is imagined and foreclosed, refused, but concerted, that will never be, but somehow, somewhere become. While a group of mid-career queer Los Angeles artists collectively named We To Be Determined that came together through an exhibition write about so much interpersonal drama. Quoting here, "Hey Olga, I'm sorry I haven't been able to add very much to this process. I have been in Oakland all week and the past several weeks have been very trying at work. Lots of tension, intense trauma exposure and very tight capacity personally. It is extremely challenging to hold it together each day doing this work and to come home to be present for family. It's felt difficult to find time and emotional energy to tie into the tasks of recounting conflict or figuring out what to add to this document. I struggle to articulate with my folks in my life how draining my job is." Going on, many collective documents are wrestling matches over the ordering of affects and thought through the most immediate platforms, methods, and contexts towards definitions of commonality or mutual aid. From the field, a non-arts community space in New Cross, London, the project named Around the Table, that is modeled after Arendt scholar Fred Dewey's work on group dialogue. Quoting from them, "The aim of this reading session, agreed among some of the field members, was to create a space in which people could speak and have an equal say. We felt that there was a struggle for the group involved in the field and increasingly for others who joined to find such a space. That while work has been done to agree on ways of working and to air differences, it has not been enough. Previously," this is me talking, "I'd been unaware of the praxis described by Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy, but learned about it over the course of editing the journal." Quoting Marie Brown, "Emergent strategies are ways for humans to practice complexity and grow the future through relatively simple interactions." Skipping further in her text, Octavia Butler, "One of the cornerstones of my awareness of emergent strategies, spoke of the fatal human flaw as a combination of hierarchy and intelligence. We are brilliant at survival, but brutal at it. We tend to slip out of togetherness the way we slip out of the womb, bloody and messy, and surprised to be alone. Able to learn with our whole bodies, the ways of the world." Newsletters from more abstractly situated collectives articulated a genuine ambivalence to the very work of community weaving that they are involved in. The contributions from the Los Angeles-based curatorial collective Museum Adjacent flatly states, "Art sucks." This formal truth is perhaps what motivates so many newsletters' efforts to come down into other relations. A contribution, and to that I'd also add politics suck. A contribution within the 4-page newsletter from Never Again working group begun at a 2019 Warsaw-based art anti-fascist conference describing the local, where each participant described local cultural conflicts, ends thusly: "The delegates managed to bring theory and practice, art and activism, and links to their struggles. Seemingly abstract discussions about art institutions proved their merit when we had to formulate a response to the alt-right takeover of one of the major art centers in Warsaw. The concreteness through abstract ambivalence mirrors the clarity that necessary mutual aid projects provide. A food pantry's newsletter, for example, though it is authored by a New York City Woodbine collective whose practice is actually quite similar to the Contentious Field newsletter, states, many of the families we are delivering food to are also asking how they can help. For community members whose MO used to be to stay off the radar, are now offering to be visible because they want to work together. The weight of this cannot be understated. Getting people together is the critical difference between charity and mutual aid. When submissions tipped from inward process-oriented descriptions to outward worlding, articulation was less agonistic. Yet, akin to the Santa Cruz Working Group, and in line with so much newsletter content, these projects aim to encounter and reweave potential constellations for local or networked meaning. The Albany, New York-based audio collective, the Center for Enchantment, posted their neighborhood newsletter, seeking stories as a means towards their radio projects and communities development. Quoting, "The Center for Enchantment is located on Grand Street and seeks offering and collaborations that animate the communities, past, present, and future, human and non-human, of this place. A story about enchantment. Once upon a time, the whole world was made of songs. There were rocks and wood and water and..." More fantastical, but less speculative, was the two-page submission by the Thunder Bay Rival Collective, made of Indigenous researchers, noted scholars, and artists, along with, artists. The newsletter was first posted in their local library, in active collaboration with the librarians towards decolonizing and rematriating the library infrastructure and land.
We already do have like a slight delay, so unfortunately we have to come to an end of the presentation. Will like 2 minutes be okay for you?
Yeah, I started at, this is just coming up on about 20 minutes now, so I have a page and I have less than a page left.
Okay.
Okay, so more fantastical but less speculative was the two-page submission by, by rematriate we mean, or what's rematriation? By rematriate we mean give back, but unlike the legal term repatriate, which signifies a simple transfer of ownership, rematriate means something more profound, a restoration of right relationships and true action of decolonization, aimed not just at righting a past wrong, but transforming our collective future. Okay, so finishing up. By supporting, then compiling local anti-fascist conceptualizations, we aimed to comprehend relations between particular anti-fascist cultural expressions and its more universal appearances, its more structuralized appearances. We hoped that this soup of anti-fascist word jazz beyond formal need might tell us something about cultural expression, its voice, might tell us something about cultural expression, its voice, its nature that would help us solve a puzzle. I'll just skip ahead to, okay, so yeah, I could just summarize where I wanted to go to next because it's the least fleshed out bit. So I ended up talking about the theorization that Nick Thoburn writes, where he went into detail about many of the submissions, talking about his bag of communist objects, things that by their nature as printed objects and the questions that they ask press against the multi-dimensional structuralization and formalization that capitalism organizes. And then asking about where he gets that from, he talks about a Deleuze and Guattari quote that talks about the animal spirits within all objects that exceed any object's ability to be read. Then I, in the last paragraph, talk about how this doesn't quite get to a general human ability to understand things outside of their context, because I also see institutional structures as something that exceeds capitalism and exceeds fascist governance. And so I wanted to, this issue wanted to look at what what we could call universality or more universal or more enlightened forms of governance. One other way to think about that, and here I pointed to by the work of trans anti-fascist scholar Mika Vanderdrift, whose work is very much around questions of political becoming. I take a very short turn towards Eduardo Cohn's work, which talks about universality not as some enlightenment concept, but rather as habits that we might just learn from and patterns and routines that are floating out in the world that humans get. So yeah, that's that.
Thank you so much for presenting that paper. Now we have time for the discussion. I think it will be most conveniently if the person who has a question will just raise a hand. Okay, so Professor Griffin has a question.
Hi. Well, you see, I think if somebody comes from outside and listens to these three presentations, it rather illustrates the problem I was trying to address. You know, what are we talking about? I mean, I was obviously talking about, from an academic historian point of view, very concerned with the theory of what we look at when we look at fascism. I was looking at a narrow definition of fascism as a particular form of extreme right, which is revolutionary and is not to be confused with radical right or populism, etc. The feminist movement is obviously anti-fascist for me, almost by definition, because patriarchy is an essential part of fascism, and it's what actually fascist regimes are wonderful illustrations of the power of feminist analysis of power. But of course, feminism is far more than a movement attacking fascism, because it has a big problem with what calls itself liberalism. I mean, just in my country, which is an extremely backward country about female rights, there are all the institutions I've ever encountered have problems about social justice, representation of non-white ethnic groups, the disabled, immigrants, women, children. I mean, a whole host of things. And these are issues for liberalism, trying to get its act together and actually live out the liberal ideal. And I suppose what I'm trying to insist on is that though any idealist, Marxist or anarchist or whatever, gay rights, ecological, etc., has major issues with fascism, that problem with fascism should not be confused with the problems we've already got with non-fascism. And I think if you can be anti-fascist, you can also be simultaneously anti-liberal. But for example, I'm very interested to hear, now I'm talking to Poles, do you really think that the Law and Justice Party, Truth and Justice Party, is fascist, or isn't it just a corruption of a liberal democracy? In other words, I find it very problematic to call Orban, Putin, Erdogan, all of these people fascist. And my point is, if you're going to be against them, you have to use appropriate weapons. So to protest against fascism may be missing its target. I am very concerned with the deliberalization of society due to identitarian movements, populist movements, ethnocentric movements, xenophobic movements, and all the other movements, but I don't feel that I'm part of an anti-fascist struggle. So I would really like to hear what some people feel about what you are trying to discuss in this conference. I mean, what are you anti?
Yes, I think that I will take it straight away, as we don't have much time. So for me, fascism is has many faces, obviously, and many characteristics. Central one for me is actually an effort to condense power to make it a state of exception and sovereignty of exception kind of power. So therefore, also assigning a homo sacer, a forbidden, positioned out of law systems group as enemy. So basically, I take the Schmittian narrative of the state And if somebody supports this narrative, for me, they are fascist. So this is the basics, yes? And so therefore, as they claim to be inspired by the notion also of paterfamilias and the state sovereign being a version of paterfamilias, they immediately express their interest in the classical patriarchal misogynistic positions. So for me,
can you make that concrete? Is Trump therefore, who's obviously patriarchal?
So please allow me to finish.
Yeah,
and
sorry,
this was just the beginning. So basically, the state of exception and assigning an enemy. So therefore, Kaczynski, by the way, who hired the translator of Carl Schmitt as one of his advisors, and this has been done also by his twin brother. So when Lech Kaczyński, the deceased Kaczyński, was the president of Poland, among his advisors, there was Marek Cichocki, who is the translator of Carl Schmitt. And while there is nothing wrong with being a translator of Carl Schmitt, there is maybe something wrong for the doctrine of the state and for the practice of the state institutions if somebody who claims to be a continuator of Carl Schmitt, which Marek Cichocki did, perpetuate his politics in an actual state. So not as a theory of political state, but as a practice of state. So therefore, Kaczynski is a fascist for me. This would be also Putin as a fascist for me, precisely because he tries to exempt himself out of the legal responsibilities and legal systems. He is now a president, 4th or 5th term, I can't remember. So therefore, he's beyond the law, and therefore structurally his politics is one also shaped by the state of exception doctrine. So I would suggest that this could be a useful definition of fascism. And all the politicians that you enumerated as possibly fascist, but we don't know, actually have this in common, that they try to produce a sovereignty which is beyond any legal constraint and limitations. And in this way, they are fascist. Obviously, they differ in details, but this is, to me, the core. So that would be my answer to your question. Thank you very much. I have a question to Marc Herbst, so I could probably also put it on the table. So basically, I'm very happy that you have read bell hooks, and I'm very happy that you found the theory of the margin and epistemology of the margin important for the making of the artistic and political entities. And I was many times attacked as somebody who would repeat the theory of the margin, as it is problematic because today we have margins somehow mixed with the center. So therefore there is no clear epistemology of the margin versus the center. The social and municipal realities are more complex. So for me, it doesn't worry me very much, but I would like to check with you whether on your side, let's say, this kind of criticism of the epistemology of the margin as being somehow perhaps rooted in some past composition of the global divisions. How do you feel about this kind of criticism, whether you take it or not?
I mean, in this way too, I'll answer I'll join the discussion in the first question. Of the first question. I mean, I haven't really encountered much of that, also because I'm involved in queer and radical communities where that sort of debate is just at the moment not really there. So, and I'm interested in, ultimately, I see the margin as another word for common life, ways in which common people generally live, knowing that the massive amount of people on this globe are outside of structural forces that are able to institute violence and ordering of the world. So I mean, and when I make a claim that our journal is marginal, it's a very slim margin that I'm referring to, whereas I'm in dialogue with people who have institutionally, culturally a lot of power. I understand that ours is marginal because of our budget and our ability to produce and our ability to appear meaningfully in general speculative discourse. That said, I do think that holding on to that perspective from outside of law, which is to address it, not antagonistically the initial question, But outside of law, where most people exist from, we do not live in relationship to written law and word as a day-to-day project, but only encounter law when we have legal problems. And so, and in that relationship, I see the margin and the common as an important space to consider, because it has much more capacity to define and meld with common social practices. So rather than thinking through, though I definitely do not deny the power of legal arguments and legal structures to uphold law for good, I think it's important to recognize that how much of life is lived outside of law either way.
Thank you.
So yeah, I guess I'm curious about what those arguments are that you hear.
I'm not sure if there maybe there are some further questions, so I'll keep it in mind. And
okay, I can see that Ms. Elżbieta Janicka has a question.
Yes, I would have a question to Professor Griffin about the revolutionary component of fascism in this definition that you put forward. What about the system we have in Poland now, which is called electoral dictatorship? So this is a system that doesn't need a revolution to operate. Further on, in electoral dictatorship is also what Hungary is now. Orban doesn't need to be a revolutionary. Moreover, he managed to change the law, the constitution, more than 10 years ago. He made it accepted by the EU. So he doesn't need to violate the law he legiferates. I mean, he has legiferated so far. Thank you.
So I'm glad you've asked that question, because you put your finger exactly on where the problems emerge, okay? The assumption seems to be that the aim of fascism is power, repression, the elimination of liberal freedoms, of pluralism, of creativity, etc. Whereas that's where the school of thought, and that's all I represent, it certainly isn't true, but the school of academic thought that I represent sees it totally differently. I could give you a long list of academics who don't agree with that premise about fascism. Because for my school, I mean, I don't own the school, but the school of fascist studies to which I belong, the aim of fascism is not to gain power. It is not to be oppressive and destroy freedom and all that sort of stuff. It is not reactionary. It is not repressive. It wants to gain power for a revolutionary purpose. If you actually study, I don't think many people have done this, if you actually study fascism and Nazism, Nazism wasn't just interested in wielding power, it wanted to actually change the ethnic and ideological, social, cultural composition of the whole world. I mean, if that's not revolutionary, Orban doesn't want to actually change the nature of society. He, by his own phraseology, is an illiberal democrat. He wants an illiberal democracy. He wants a Hungarian state run for Hungarians, which marginalizes migrants, ethnic minorities, Sinti, Roma, Jews, and influence from other people. But he also wants it to be part of the EU. Can you imagine Hitler allowing the Third Reich to be an integral part of a liberal capitalist system which cultivated entertainment and iPhones and pornography and mass consumption? People just simply don't see, who don't agree with my school of fascist studies, that they don't take seriously the revolutionary urge of fascists to create a new civilization. Don't believe me, I am nothing But major intellectuals like George Mosser, Stanley Payne, Dave Sternhell, and a whole host of other people I could quote to you, take seriously. That doesn't mean to say they justify it. That doesn't mean to say that fascists don't use propaganda. But we believe that fascists were intent on creating an alternative civilization, not just to communism, but to liberalism. Now, obviously, if you don't accept that, then Putin is a fascist, Erdogan is a fascist, Assad is a fascist. But I see these people as fundamentally repressive and reactionary and quite narcissistic in their use of power. But Nazism was, for me, a serious project to create a new type of modern society, and therefore it was revolutionary. I'll never convince you, but it is very important, if we're going to talk about anti-fascism, what we think we're trying to oppose. And I would say that you fight illiberalism with liberalism, and you fight fascism with the law. Everything that fascists propose is illegal. It's illegal to whip up racial hatred and to be anti-Semitic, etc., etc. It should be fought with the law. And I do not know what the value of mass demonstrations is. Now, in the case of Black Lives Matter, that has had a visible change. There are some moments where mass protest is really important. But from a British perspective, if you look at the history of Marxist anti-fascism in Britain, the Anti-Fascist League, the Anti-Nazi League, honestly, they were largely recruitment events for recruiting more fascists to Marxist politics. They had absolutely no impact on actual fascism at all. So we just have to be clear what we're against.
But
Marc.
I wonder if what you're describing and what you very clearly articulated is the changing of the law, that I'm not going to quote you right, changing of the law and overturning the constitution of the Nazi parties versus the general social unrest of Orban, for say, taxed on very well to the dynamic between institutionality and common being, tacked very well onto conversations around dual power, where you have both a party structure and you have a governing structure. And so while I'm interested in your distinctions, because I think they are extremely useful, I wonder what you make of the dynamic of a Nazi party which was, as you know, legally elected and used culture and law to change both. Yeah. What do you make of that dynamic?
Well, what I'd say is, speaking as a historian of interwar period, it's a different dynamic. I'm against both. I mean, I think any real humanist, and that means not just a Western secular humanist, anybody who takes seriously the core principles of Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. So when Buddhists in Myanmar attack Muslims as being ethnically different and calling them all terrorists and driving them out, that's not fascist, but it's utterly unacceptable, and it's a travesty. It's an attack on Buddhism. So I would say, as an anguished liberal humanist, I feel like a little island in an ocean of things I detest, which are destroying the planet, which are destroying humanity. But I just because I'm a pedant, I like distinctions between all these different horrible forces. And for example, all fascism is male chauvinist, but not all male chauvinism is fascist, for example. And so I just wonder when I read some speeches against fascism, what they really think they are. And when I've been engaging, and I have been engaging with anti-Trump movements in America, I've written emails, I've been invited to debate Trumpism as fascism, and the level of debate and the level of historical awareness and the level of actual intellectual effort in it is so pathetic that all you end up is a whole load of rhetoric and absolute ineffectuality. The way they got rid of Trump was through the democratic process, not through street protests saying refuse fascism. So in a way, I just throw that out to people. I love the energy behind a mass protest against fascism, but I really would like more people to know what they're actually against and actually ask. You see, the trouble with, for example, violent protest against Trump is it actually fed a Trumpist narrative that Biden represented the forces of anarchy and communism. So you have to be very careful with your tactics. The real work to get rid of Trump was done through democratic channels, I believe. And a lot of the far left attack on the fascism of Trump, I actually think a lot of it was actually counterproductive. Now, sorry, I stopped.
Yeah, because I think that you're obviously right, and I do agree with the point that there is. I mean, in my argument, all those strategies have their importance. So to me, I'm somehow perturbed. I remember still the debates over, reform versus revolution. You remember those as well, probably much more than I do.
I'm older, yeah.
I'm not trying this
but I agree,
wasn't the major point. But anyhow, what I'm trying to say is that I recently came across a beautiful sort of revision of this distinction by Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, who in their book about the assembly, which is about something quite different because it's about organizing the common. So they start to think about the common in terms of institution. I think it's a big shift for somebody who, like Negri, was completely anti-institutional, and suddenly he starts to, rethink his own ontology. I like this step very much, but on the margin somehow of these reflections, they both go into the discussion of reform versus revolution, and they find out that actually, as these terms have been coined in the 19th century, perhaps if we want to, if we want to still discuss reformism versus revolutionary strategies, we have to rethink what these concepts mean today, because today they mean probably something very different. And I believe that, for instance, our conference might have far more of grassroots insights than many conferences organized, let's say, by the NGOs, which typically are associated with grassroots movements. So we are facing kind of paradoxes and contradictions in contemporary organization of the society, which makes it very difficult to legitimately argue against a particular set of strategies. So again, as much as I appreciate the kind of emphasis on the democratic processes as because it agrees also with my argument about Schmidt. So as a proper anti-Schmittian, of course, I want to build institutions, as many as I can, just to make this process of exemption from the law by the sovereign authority, whoever it will be, Hitler, Kaczynski, whoever they want to put in this position. It's gonna, building institutions and trying to make them functional. So not rejecting them as they are, today in Poland, for instance, you will hear very often that courts are already corrupted by the current government. So therefore, we should not believe in legal institutions as they exist. I don't think this is true. And there are many judges who try to resist in this very everyday ways, as I was trying to emphasize, the everyday, the ordinary. So they basically come to courts and they still try to perform justice institutional work in the best way they can, regardless of whatever kind of shifts the government wants them to do. And I believe that we need to appreciate these remnants, let's say, shrinking remnants, I would suggest, of proper institutional work. This is very important. But then, on the other hand, in Poland, the massive social movements going to the streets and doing the protests in the street, they allow to express dissent, which otherwise for many years now has not been visible. So for many years we had the polls and the statistics of popularity of political party so unproportionately positive for the running government that the opposition was not even visible. And therefore these street protests, they allowed everyone to see that there is actually quite a lot.
No, that's fantastic. And look at Belarus. I mean, I'm not against mass protest, but I'm just, I just would ask, and for example, I would ask if, I was a university lecturer for a long time and we discussed these things in my classes, but I tried to, well, because I believe in liberal democracy, I was trying to encourage some of my more radical militant students to think not just of student politics, but also of getting a position high enough in our society as a judge or as an MP or what, get into the system to change it. There is an European Union which believes in certain principles which are absolutely ignored by parties in Poland and Hungary, for example. And I just don't think enough work is being done by the Court of Human Rights and by the committees within the EU, because we don't have enough idealism actually within the system, because so much anti-fascism is anti-systemic. That refused fascism, for example, wants to destroy America to replace it with a Marxist state. Well, I don't think that's very helpful. So all I'm saying is, if you find somebody who's being a militant in the street, that's great. But I hope in his or her private life, they are thinking seriously about where can I place my energy, my creativity, my intelligence, so that I can make this society better, rather than trying to destroy the system. That's all.
Yeah, I believe that this is exactly what also the current feminist movement is trying to do, by not only practicing the militancy, but also by collecting all kinds of demands and ideas for the future society. So they are already assuming that this government is going, and therefore they are trying to provide sort of, I would say, grassroots institutions. So something that is exactly on the intersection of the division, grassroots institutions of public debate, of public discourse, in order to produce demands which actually reflect oppositional perspective. And they do it, unfortunately, I think, in too sharp of an opposition with the existing political parties. I think they could get closer to the existing political parties, and therefore I would support your line. But generally, this process of creating alternative institutions, I would say counter publics, because this is what actually they are doing, is actually quite fascinating, and it's quite massive, and it's becoming quite democratic. So people are actually involving in, debates, in organizing conditions for debates which allow to produce political ideas, and like this, it can be much more efficient, I think, in the making of the politics of the future, but also in the transforming of today's politics from solely protest into building alternatives, basically. So I think that's a good process, and actually this is why I'm trying to say that, I mean, as the feminist women's strike here decided to basically cover all the aspects of social life with new ideas and new demands, because that it became so massive that actually, they have a sense, I think, legitimate sense, that they are quite representative for the majority of society right now already. So therefore, there is a sense that also such sectors as I don't know, medicine, culture, everywhere there has to be change, and people are debating right now the demands for transforming, from courts and the army and the police, all kinds of fields where politics can be important. So it seems that there is an effort to apply this kind of, I would call it, transversality in approach. So basically a combination of, very. Bożena, you appeared. Do you want to talk or?
Yes. I have a question to Professor Griffin, and I will be very concrete, because there is a problem probably between theory, fascism as a subject of a theory, and fascism as a subject of history. And what we will do with was Franco not a fascist?
No.
Was Mussolini not a fascist? Or are you talking about the revolutionary fascism? Are you talking only about Nazism?
No. I'll give you a long list of fascist movements. Why did Salazar get rid of the blue shirts? Why did Vargas get rid of the AIB in Brazil? Why did Franco emasculate the Falange by fusing it with the Carlists? The list goes on and on. Also, why did Antonescu destroy the Iron Guard? Because there is a fundamental conflict between authoritarian, military-minded, power-crazed, whatever, and real fascism. Conservatives hate real fascism. They may annex it, they may appropriate it when it's useful, but they don't want to destroy the conservative order and the church and the existing class structure. Fascists are far more radical than modernizing conservatives. Salazar wasn't a fascist, Pinochet wasn't a fascist, the list goes on. Now, obviously, a regime that tortures students and throws their bodies out of helicopters isn't fascist, because you don't have to be a fascist to actually commit atrocities, human atrocities. Stalin committed atrocities. It doesn't make him a fascist. As a humanist, and a historian, I try to understand the different categories of inhumanity and to see them all as stemming from the same psychological and political illness, I think is very unhelpful. Franco was not a fascist, which is why he was able to move from a regime which promoted the image of the Falange to a regime that promoted Opus Dei and the church. He made a smooth transition to a Catholic authoritarian state. And it doesn't, and if you just see him as a fascist, you don't understand what happened in Spain. I mean, it does make no sense. There is no serious historian of Spain, I can give you a long list, who thinks that Franco was a fascist. There are many Marxists who will still tell you that they're, and that's because from a Marxist point of view, there's only one revolution, and the revolution is Marxist. So anything else that calls itself a revolution is a counter-revolution and is actually reactionary because it's stopping the real revolution. But that's just being trapped in the Marxist paradigm. I mean, so I would say that obviously I have my vision. I hold hands with any anti-fascist that doesn't use extreme violence and knows where to target their energy. I love the art produced by anti-fascism from a Marxist perspective. Some of the greatest murals and paintings and works of art. There's the photo montages of Hartfield, which are total genius. They're marvelous. And to have a Marxist theory of fascism is fantastic, creative. But if you're going to look at it historically, you soon hit big problems. That's all I'm saying. And I think that the marvelous anti-government energy in Poland is, for me, it's an explosion of genuine liberal humanism. It's not an explosion of anti-fascism. That's what I'm saying.
I think one thing that I'd like to add to this is just an open question of, in relationship to this question, but in relationship to the mine, Eva's presentation, is a question of what way are general human social capacities, that things that occur outside of law. So what way are general human social capacities under law organized against or for individual human freedom of choice and liberation? So that there's this conflict that is inherent in this debate, I think, that is bound by the fact that humans generally just exist outside of law, but only under legal structures are they recognized as human, as Schmidt and Agamben and whomever discuss. And so, and I feel like one problem in the tension that you two are debating is the fact that we're debating a very slippery subject of the fact that human sociality continues regardless of law, and yet we can only debate it through particular forms of law that may or may not actually tweak small angles of human capacity for freedom and self-definition. But that really does matter, those distinctions.
Okay, I'd have to think a lot about that. But certainly the beauty of human creativity and humanity means that when you look in a granular way at what was going on in the Third Reich, there were all sorts of marginal spaces where human beings were still able to be human. And that, of course, is anti-fascist and anti-Nazi, but it also is gloriously human. And so I just think that, yeah, ultimately our stupid distinctions, academic definitions, intellectual paradigms don't really matter. I started off with the problem of Auschwitz and Buchenwald when I was 17, and I wanted to understand why. I don't want to give the impression that I believe in the intrinsic value of definitions and isms, but I fought hard, I'm 72, to try and get my own mental handle on what went on in the camps. And personally, I'm deeply dissatisfied by an idea that all that was going on was the cruel exercise of power. For me, it was something much more similar to what Robespierre was doing with the guillotine, and what Pol Pot was doing in the killing field. So all I'm saying is that whatever makes people want to fight fascism, that's fantastic from my point of view. But there are moments in modern liberal democracies where it's important to make distinctions. I heard a wonderful program about the gay movement in Poland, which is trying to react against the oppressive nature of the current Polish regime. I thought the energy was fantastic. It doesn't really matter whether the gay liberation movement in Poland thinks of itself as anti-fascist or not, from my point of view. It is still a symbol of resistance to oppression and stereotyping. So in a way, it doesn't really matter what I've been saying. I just thought I'd lob that into the discussion.
Okay, so we ran out of time like 20
A long
minutes
time
ago.
ago.
But that debate was super interesting, and yeah, it was really great. Are there any other questions, or?
Everybody's exhausted by English now. This is linguistic battle fatigue, yeah?
I see no further question, so I would like to thank once again to all of our speakers today. Those presentations were great, and we, I think, learned a lot. I also want to thank for all of the participants for coming to our online conference. And I would like to invite you for day 2. Tomorrow we are going to start at 10 a.m. With a keynote speech by Angela Dimitrakaki. So thank you once again.